Konnichiwa, and welcome to Distilled the Bourbon Podcast. This is a very special international episode today, fellas. I'm Brent. These are my co-hosts, Brian and Chuck, and it's going to be a good episode, I can tell already.
We're going to be spreading our wings today.
Yeah. Are you guys experts in the field of international whiskeys?
Lord, no.
Absolutely not. That's why we brought in the expert today.
Yeah, we absolutely have a great expert here today. With us is from our friends over at the Broken Cork podcast, Justin Strumpfer.
Yep.
Is that right? And you are a whiskey expert.
Yes, for the most part. I actually got a few certifications through the Council of Whiskey Masters. My latest one through them is Certified Whiskey Specialist, which actually entails the broad scope of whiskey across the sea.
Cool. So you know everything there is to know about Scotch, about bourbon, and about our topic today, Japanese whiskeys, right?
Well, yes and no.
Yeah. Well,
I know enough to be dangerous. But there's only so much a Gaijin like me who's not born in Japan can actually
there you go.
portray.
Chuck, why would we talk about this anyway? What's the big deal with Japanese whiskeys?
Well, Justin is an authority on it for one thing, so we're trying to broaden our wings. But what I really love is that Brent this morning shared with us a 2020 article from VinePair written by Aaron Goldfarb, and is titled "How Japan Created the Modern American Bourbon Market." Now, I knew that there were brands that went to Japan during the doldrums of the bourbon industry. I knew Four Roses pretty much decamped, leaving only a crappy blended Four Roses brand in the U.S., or if it disappeared altogether, and good stuff was going to Japan. This is a much broader article about how that at a time when sales of bourbon were declining in the U.S., the young Japanese did not want to drink the Scotch or Japanese whiskey that their parents were drinking. They were looking for something new, and there were American distilleries that said, how about you try bourbon? And they partnered with companies like Suntory in Japan, and the young Japanese adults just went for it in a big time and didn't just buy quantities, but they bought older and enjoyed older vintages and bottles of American bourbon and single barrel and things that just were not selling in the U.S. went over very well in Japan and really kind of sustained the American bourbon industry for a time in the 70s, 80s, 90s.
It's a really interesting period in history, at least as far as whiskey and bourbon specifically go. Here we are in the U.S. in the 70s and the 80s, not really digging bourbon. There were some folks like you and I that were still drinking bourbon, but it was really a clear liquids kind of thing, right, Brian?
Yeah.
And at the same time, over in Japan, there was this cultural revolution where this anti-establishment mindset of the youth that happened here in the 60s happened over there in the 70s and 80s, and they didn't want to drink dad's Scotch-like whiskey that the parents like. Is that right? Is all that true?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, it's kind of funny. It's that you mentioned that, because as we were going through our vodka phase and our gin phase in the 70s and 80s, they were going through their whiskey phase. But now that we're getting back into our Scotch and Irish and Japanese phase here, drinking the whiskeys here in the U.S., they're moving on to different things, just how the palates for the different ages switch through the days.
It's amazing. And they bought enough to save the bourbon industry back in the late 70s, early 80s. When we just had products sitting on the shelf, can you imagine the problem that the bourbon industry had at the time is we can't sell this stuff.
Especially the super aged stuff, 12 years plus, that just wasn't selling in the U.S. market. They're exporting that overseas, and the Japanese just ate it up, and they just loved it. Nowadays, it's hard to find a 12-year bourbon in this market. I mean, for a decent price, especially.
And this was at a time when young Japanese adults were really fascinated by American culture. They were really into denim and jeans. They were really into things like Coca-Cola. I know a fellow and have interviewed him before who's a really big guy in the global denim industry. And he made a comment that when the Japanese become passionate about something, they become very passionate about it. And they became very passionate about bourbon.
Well, that's great news for us, because now we have we don't have more bourbon than we drink. We have not enough bourbon to buy, but certainly all the old labels are kind of making a comeback for us. So, Justin, with that foundation, what do we need to know about the Japanese whiskey market?
I'll tell you, it started way before the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
It actually started way back in the 1872.
Wow.
So it all started with a case of Old Parr smoky Scotch whiskey, which actually spearheaded the passion for Shinjiro Tori, how should I put this? He was a philanthropist and marketeer initially of sake and wine spirit or rice spirits. But he couldn't do it by himself, so he actually, with the help of Matsutaka Taketsuru, which was his selected master distiller at the time, who was also enjoying whiskey, and initially apparently a toothpaste salesman. He was also a renowned chemist at the time.
You got to watch out for those chemistry majors, let me tell you.
Exactly. He actually got shipped over to Scotland and started studying the process of how to make good Scotch at Hazelburn, and I believe it is Longmore distilleries for about 3 to 5 years, and he got married over there to a lovely Scottish lady.
Wow.
So that's why the Scottish influence is so prevalent in Japan?
Correct. They actually they're the ones that actually started pushing that spirit style in Japan. They wanted to replicate Scotch whiskey and bring it to Japan and distribute it. But what they were worried about is how it would actually appeal to the Japanese palate.
Mm-hmm.
Japanese palate's different than the American palate to the Scottish palate. Everything that you actually... A palate is basically past and place. What is the past of that person? Like, what have you grown up on? Somebody from the South grew up on different flavors and different mindset and different tastes than somebody from up north and from somebody all the way across the sea. And that has to speak volumes onto how Japanese whiskey has developed over time. And one thing, like you said before, the Japanese do is once they get their mindset on something, they drive it forward. So unlike Scotch, which basically took hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition and trial and error to really bring up a good product, they went and replicated in the lab. They went and did the research on what would make a really good whiskey.
Now, was this a peaty Scotch?
Their initial white label was the smokiest, peatiest thing that they ever released, and it bombed.
Well,
the first one bombed, and actually in 1930s, after Yamazaki was developed and actually built a distillery was built up, there was a split within the first few years of production to either keep with the peated tradition, which actually led to Nika distillery being produced, and that was spearheaded by Matsutaka, and Tori, who actually pushed into the Suntory Whiskey Company, wanted unpeated. He wanted light. He felt that would appeal more to the Japanese palate than did a heavily peated Scotch. Now, they didn't do away with it fully, but he had to actually do a trial and error on what's going to appease them.
Sure.
You know what's interesting about this? You're talking about the 1870s, 1900s, 1920s. Japan was a very closed society at that time.
Yep. In the 1900s, early, I think 1910, they started the Americanization or westernization of Japan. They were starting to bring in the genes. They were starting to bring in other whiskeys, which would sell. What else was happening here in the U.S. in 1913 to 1930? Anybody?
Prohibition.
There you go.
Yeah.
Who was drinking our whiskey? Japan.
Okay.
Other than those with a card who could get their prescription.
Exactly. I bet you still have one of those.
I
don't
do,
you?
yeah.
Anyway, that was one thing that actually pushed Shinjiro Tori to actually start the Yamazaki company, is he was tired of seeing all of Japan's money go out of the country. He to American and Scotch distilleries. He wanted to actually produce something that was palatable and approachable for everybody in Japan, not just the select few who like peat, as a lot of people do not.
Mm-hmm. Big me.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. Hopefully you enjoy some of these.
I'll enjoy them.
It goes to the mindset of most of Japan, like you said, innovation, but also keeping to tradition. I think he put it best is to keep driving, and today's innovation is tomorrow's tradition.
So there was that mindset before World War II, and then the recovery that came, and that's what we think of. Well, when I went to management school, when I took my master's program, we learned a lot about that post-war revolution that happened, the Industrial Revolution in the Pan-Asian area. But this is well before that. So was there another wave coming in when that happened?
There have been multiple waves, and actually when the first big wave got started in Japan, it hit right as they were going into a recession. Mm-hmm. In the 1930s to 1940s, they were down.
Right.
But then once they started building back up, they had a boom as well in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They started getting huge into production, and they actually started outdoing most of the bourbon distilleries around here. Actually, Hakushu, which is owned by the Suntory Whiskey Company, made more spirit than anybody in the world, mainly for blended malts, because that was what was that was hot at the time, and distributed worldwide for that. And it was absolutely amazing. Now they're only down to, I believe, a third of production now due to the pallet shift that's happened. And to get more into that, when Japan started first drinking whiskey, you didn't drink the high-end stuff because it tasted good. Most people who drank the high-end stuff were the vice presidents, the presidents, higher people up in the business. People who drank the white label, the black labels, and the bottom of the barrel, which is, I shouldn't say that, but it was still good whiskey. Mm-hmm. But the cheap stuff was the common man.
Yeah. Same here, right?
Exactly. But that being said, if you got a promotion at work, it actually correlate to the whiskey you drank. Mm. So if you got a promotion to being a manager, you start getting to that red label or that green label. Then you get up to the Regency or the
C-suite,
basically.
Vice president of 12 year. I like it.
Exactly.
Sounds good.
There you go. But it was more of a class hierarchy to what you drank instead of just what you like.
Okay.
That shifted away in the 80s to 90s to wanting pure, clean, deep, and very rich flavors while still maintaining the subtlety and balance that Japanese whiskey has brought to the world, rather than, say, an Islay Scotch. How should I put this? An Islay Scotch and like a heavily cast strength bourbon, or just like a roaring river. Mm-hmm. Picture Japanese whiskey as more as a tepid pond. Okay. It's all there. You have all the flavors. It's simplistic. It's calm, but it has deep flavor. That's what it's meant to be. So
since Suntory bought Jim Beam, there's been a huge shift towards more Japanese whiskeys. I'm assuming because Suntory, owns it, and they're wanting more Japanese whiskey in the American market. Has there been an uptick in Japanese export for whiskey since the Suntory acquisition?
Yes, there has been an uptick in sales to the American market, mainly for the regulations we have on what's considered whiskey. Most other locations, you have to be fermented with yeast and yeast alone. Some of the Japanese distilleries actually still ferment with mold called roku. It ferments very similar to yeast, gives you almost a lighter palate, but a lot of people think that's cheating because they're not using a yeast strain. They are still using yeast in certain blends and bringing it in. It's just that extra flavor factor or the lightness that they're wanting from that. It's usually a rice whiskey that they're blending in.
Okay.
And since we in the U.S. market don't require for our whiskey regulations that it has to be fermented with strictly yeast, they can still sell here, and they're selling in higher quantities.
So, do the Japanese market, do they have defined regulations as what a Japanese whiskey can be?
As of 2 years ago, they dropped the regulation for what Japanese whiskey has to be, and they have until, I think, March 2024 to bring everything up to code. So they're going off of close to mindset of Scotch in a few of their regulations, but they are still keeping it broad. They mainly have to use water that is from Japan. I don't know why they were importing water, since they have some of the cleanest water I've ever had. They actually have the top 100 best water springs in their nation just mapped out. If you ever want to go there, you can drink it right from the spring.
I imagine that volcanic rock filtration is probably produces a pretty good product.
Volcanic, and there's a lot of granite there, which does lead to extra minerals in the water, but hopefully not a lot of iron.
Mm-hmm.
Has to be fermented and distilled and aged in Japan, but they don't say what you have to ferment it with. It does have to contain malt of some kind, but that doesn't mean it can't be blended with something else. They do still have the same as Scotch, which is single malt, blended malt, single grain, as well as blended grain whiskey. And I actually brought one of those here, which is a single grain, but a lot of people don't feel almost taken back by Japanese single grain. If you think about it here, what would we use as a single grain whiskey in the United States?
Corn.
Exactly. What do you use in Scotland? Barley, rye, grow well there. Same with, or you could even use sorghum. People feel taken aback because Japan uses a lot of rice. Why not?
Sure.
It's very subtle. It's very clean. It gives you a light flavor, but people feel that since there is a rice whiskey category, they're feeling taken aback when it's called single grain right now. And that's kind of just a little tension currently in the Japanese industry.
So it sounds very complex to me, but let me try to simplify it in my mind as a newcomer. Please. You know, in the U.S., we have rye, we have wheated, we have high rye bourbons, we have sour mash. We got Kentucky straight, and then you have the proof levels. And you kind of know where you're going to be with the proof level. So give me the broadest 40,000 foot view of the Japanese market. You've got some high peated Scotch-like whiskeys, right?
Yep. So you have the whole range similar to what you have in Scotland.
Okay.
For whiskey styles. And I mean, Japan innovates 10 times more than any other industry. I'll tell you that right now. Most people, if they have a distillery, they're going to make a still type, that whether that be pot or column, and they will only have that one style. If you look at Glenfiddich, they at one point, I believe, had 26 stills, the exact same style, the exact same height, and they just ran them. And if they needed more production, they made another still that could help it. Japan, if you ever go to the still house, it's a breathtaking experience because they will have every style of column you could think and pot still you could think of: fat, tall, thin, wide, and that gives them a plethora of different whiskeys coming off those stills to blend with and get the right flavor profile that they want. But the main things I've been seeing from Japanese whiskey is, let's just go with a single malt. They like to make either a peated and unpeated. They have those little blend, and they'll blend them together. Still considered a single malt, no matter how much peat you use. They will use actually a wooden washbacks, is what I've mainly seen in the area, which gives them a at the end of their fermentation, a lactobacillic infection gives them fruitier notes.
Okay.
They actually, for fermentation, like to use two different styles of yeast. Unlike us here in the U.S., we have a batch yeast in most productions around here, which they've grown over time. They actually use a distiller's yeast as well as a brewer's yeast to give it a little more fruity notes, a little more deep flavor. Even though it doesn't give them the highest yield, it creates more of those esters, those lactones that actually come out better in aging. They have to be aged now for a minimum 3 years. They'll use first fill, second fill, sherry cask or bourbon barrels. So you get plenty of flavor there coming in. They'll also use what most other places do not. It's a Mitsunara oak cask, which is Japanese oak, or Mitsunara is actually translated to water oak. It actually started being used when Prohibition started becoming a thing here in the U.S. They couldn't get any used bourbon barrels, so they decided, oh, well, we got oak up here. Let's just start using that instead.
So is it a similar profile to a white oak?
Not in the least.
Not anywhere close, huh?
Okay. I almost say it's similar to a red oak, and it is the tyloses in it are in the wood itself, make it very poor as a cast style, because those tyloses are what make white oak watertight. So most of those Mitsunara casks were prone to leakage, but it has more of a sandalwood, mint, and what else is there? There's some vanilla and coconut notes, but the main thing they get off of that is a incense, like you'd see in or how should I put this? It's Old Temple is what they go. So if you ever went into an old Catholic church,
sure,
that is what they say really comes out from a Mitsunara oak cask. And it does give a different flavor profile. I actually brought the Matsui, which we can try here in a little bit, but that is specifically aged single malt in a new uncharred Mitsunara oak cask. So you can actually get the full flavor of it.
So before we sample anything, I've got this very, very basic question. I'm a bourbon guy, not a Scotch guy. When in the bourbon world, if you hear the word malt, you're thinking about malted barley.
Correct.
So what is a single malt in the Scotch and Japanese whiskey world? What's that referring to?
Single malt is now commonly referred to as barley malt. You can actually have a single malt of any style of grain, but it is commonplace to say you can actually malt corn. If you malt the corn, though, you have to call it corn malt. If you malt rye, you have to call it rye malt or malted rye. Malted barley is the only one that can be classified as single malt without having to specify the grain.
Okay,
cool. Well, while we've been listening and learning, I've been sipping this little cocktail that you made for us. Tell us about this.
This is a traditional summer cocktail from Japan called the Mitsuwari. All it is ice, water, and whiskey. But over there, they do not have air conditioning, so when it gets in the 80s to 90s, it is high humidity over there. You need to cool yourself off. So this is their version of a highball without the club soda base.
Nice.
And it is fantastic. Most people would drink about 5 or 6 of these at a sitting and have probably 1 or 2 before they're waiting for their meal at the local dive bar.
Yeah, I love it. It's very nice, very light.
It's very calm, very easy to drink. And I mean, I haven't heard a single word from any of you. This does have some peat in it.
It does.
I can definitely taste the peat.
Just for a fact.
I mean, it's pretty subtle to me. So which whiskey did you make this with?
This whiskey I made with the Hibiki Harmony. It is one of the blended whiskeys coming out of Japan, made by the Suntory company, and they used blends from some of their different sites. And it just has a little bit of smoke, a little bit of calmness, but it does have a fruity appeal to it.
Is that on the local shelves around here, or is that something you can get?
It is, actually. I know up in Evansville, we usually have it on the shelf. I know you've had it a couple times down.
Yeah, it's harder to get, but yeah, it is on the shelf at some stores.
Mm-hmm. I think this bottle I've been sitting on for a few years, so I don't know quite what the price is.
It's about $80 to $90,
which ain't bad.
Not for an import and a decent whiskey. No, it's not bad at all.
especially with how colored that is. Now they do not specify whether or not you could use color in Japan yet, but I believe they still can use a caramel coloring, just like Scotch whiskey and Irish.
Okay. So no turpentine, no tobacco spit, nothing like
Sadly, no.
that. Okay. Well, let's taste a few more and let's talk about them.
All right. So we've got the Mitsuwari to just kind of be as a palate cleanser. We can start off with the Toki. This is Suntory. I hear a lot, basically, about imports being so expensive. Why are we? Why should I shell out for $100 bottle or upwards of $200 to $300 when I haven't tasted it and I can get stuff here for cheaper? Brought one that is about $40.
Nice.
The Suntory Toki. This is the common man's drink from Japan. It's one of the few that we can get.
Is this Jim Beam White Label?
In Japan?
No, Japanese white label.
Okay. So with bourbon just booming here in the States, I know you said the palate of the Japanese has changed.
Correct.
So is bourbon not as hot now as it was in years past?
Bourbon is not as hot across the sea. It's still with the highly dense population that they have, it is still pretty hot over there because everybody's wanting something to cool off with. But Japan and Japanese whiskey is really trying to tailor and bring people back to their market, and they have home field advantage there. They know what to pair with their current palate, something a company based here in the U.S. really can't do.
So this is Suntory Whiskey Toki, and it's a 86 proof.
So you visited a Kentucky distillery, and they're likely going to tell, especially newcomers, how to sample Kentucky bourbon, starting off with a little whiskey in the mouth, just to kind of condition your mouth, to swirl the whiskey in the glass a little bit, to nose it, to take a sip, do the Kentucky chew, all that. How does one sample Scotch or Japanese whiskey? What do you recommend?
Well, it depends on the style of whiskey you have. If you smell peat, take it slow. Take it. I'll tell you that right now. Otherwise, you will burn out.
Noted.
But most Japanese whiskeys are light and calm. Unlike bourbon, which usually you get your caramels, your vanillas, your oak notes all the way in the forefront. Japanese whiskey keeps it calm. You can pick out flavors even on the nose without being assaulted by proof. Most of these, like I said, they're meant for the daily drinker. They're meant for as many people as possible to enjoy. Now, some people would say that sounds like what Basil Hayden was trying to do down at 80 proof, and it has no flavor. If you get a nose on this, you'll see it's light, but it will go all the way back. Yeah.
So I think this might make an interesting cocktail. I don't know if I want to sip it. And I don't mean to be rude to anyone. It's a little alcohol-y to me, and maybe that's
young whiskey or younger whiskey. I mean, if you look at the color there, this was probably barely aged 3 years, and it was not in a new charred oak barrel like you're.
It's very light. So if you're not watching on YouTube, you should be, because we're awesome. But if you're just listening to us, it's a very pale yellow color. I wouldn't say it's anywhere near amber at all. But very interesting.
On the nose, I really get the ethanol.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Swirl it and let it open up a little bit. It is, and then just give it a light taste. If it's too much ethanol for you, this is only at 86 proof. It is not going to burn your palate.
Brian, what are you thinking?
A lot of what you're thinking. I mean, it's okay. I definitely wouldn't drink it neat on a daily basis for sure. Mm-hmm. I'd be curious to see how it opens up on the rocks.
This is another one that they would throw in one of the Mitsuwaris.
Oh yes, I could see that.
This would be. Mm-hmm. It's rich enough to throw enough flavor in there to really.
Does the Japanese culture, are they accustomed to drinking it like out of a Glencairn neat, or do they typically mix or add water to
Most of them mix. Most of them, they can even chill it down. They, like I said before, most of Japan does not have AC, so during the summer months, even the fall, it's still warm there. They're slugging back something to keep them cool half the time.
I do like it better with a little water in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that, to your point, I think the article that Chuck referenced earlier also said that that first generation of bourbon drinkers in the 70s, well, I guess it's not the first generation, but the generation of the 70s and 80s that were drinking bourbon really liked cocktails, and they didn't drink at home as much as they went out to drink. So I thought that was interesting.
A lot of people, they wouldn't afford to keep. Japan isn't the area where you're going to bring a ton of people to your house to enjoy drinks.
No room, right?
There's really not much room. Most apartments over there are just big enough for a family, and that's about it. And you're really pressed for space. So if you want to go out, if you want to be social, you typically go out. That's their whole culture. Is they have multiple different dive bars that people just go and congregate. It's like the after work special. It's what you do.
Right.
You're done with work 5, 6 o'clock. If you're not wanting to go home, if you want to socialize, you go to a karaoke bar. You go to a grill or something like that, just to enjoy company of other people.
Perfect.
So I definitely do get a peat on the tongue.
Yep.
Not on the nose, but on the tongue. It's not overwhelming. It's delicate.
When you do add water to this one, though, you do get a little waxiness that comes out.
Yeah.
I do feel that. And
it's just a little smoother to me when I know it's only 86 proof, but it just calms it down enough to where I appreciate it a little bit more on the neat side.
So in the wintertime, are the Japanese likely to drink their whiskey neat?
They would drink it neat. They also switch to other cocktails that are around. They may even do something close to a hottie toddy as we do in the States with tea, only theirs is a lot better than what we typically use. It ain't from a little bag.
I went back to the cocktail that you made to clear the palate, and thinking, man, that's a good drink. I drink that all day long.
Yeah, and it's simple. 2 parts water. Fill it with ice, and then I think I did a shot and a half of the hibiki.
Okay.
All right.
And when you say a shot and a half, that's a 1.5 ounce, or that's 2 ounce?
1.5 ounce.
Okay.
Oh, we could touch on that too. A shot ain't always a shot everywhere you go.
Right.
In Japan, they use only 1 ounce as a standard shot for their drinks. Here in the U.S., we use 1.5 ounces. I think Australia's around like 1.75 ounces.
They're always trying to do something bigger.
Aussies and their Barbies and their 1.75s.
And I can't remember who, but there's one place I know that delivers 2 ounces.
It's got to be Germany.
I wouldn't doubt if it's Germany.
It's got to be Germany.
Hey, bring it, my friend.
Exactly. All right.
And here's a beer to go along with it.
So let's switch over to another one of the Suntory line. We're going to go with the Hakushu. This is a 12-year-old single malt Japanese whiskey, aged 12 years, so it actually does have an age statement on it. This one is actually aged up in the southern Alps of Japan. And I bet you'll notice here, I think I have only one currently, but almost all Japanese whiskey is a screw top.
I did notice that, yeah.
So even though this is a fairly pricey bottle, it still uses a screw cap. And the reason they did that is has better closure rates, better opening rates, and you do not get the corked smell or taint that you get from having a cork stop your whiskey.
So while we're pouring, I want to ask you this question. After a bottle of whiskey of whatever stripe has been opened, how long, in your opinion, does it stay good?
Depends on how much air's in the bottle.
Sure.
Okay. If you've cracked it and taken a sip of it and want to put it back on the shelf, there's not much air in there to oxidize the congeners that are in the whiskey. So for what you're tasting in these whiskeys, it is 99.9% alcohol and water. That there's a 0.1% of congeners in here that are the esters and everything else that actually make up those flavor compounds that you're actually tasting. And honestly, they're technically faults in a true whiskey, but it's those faults that make them each whiskey its own and its flavor profile.
You're saying a fault,
Yep,
as in like something wrong.
correct.
Okay.
And you don't need to have just because there's a fault in it does not make it bad. It just brings out differences, and in those differences, we can find the beauty that makes each whiskey palatable and appreciated.
So I was given a interesting bottle of whiskey that I really want to bring in on a blind tasting in the future. I would call it kind of a finished whiskey. And there were three of us pulling on that bottle, and there's only a couple of inches left. Are you telling me that I probably need to go straight home and go ahead and consume that?
Within the next month or so, as depending on how long it was opened.
I'm gonna take that to mean the next 48 hours.
Oh,
That's exactly right.
use
So-
that excuse, buddy.
So we're going to try Hakushu single malt Japanese whiskey, 12-year. It's also an 86 proof.
Mhm.
Beautiful bottle. I don't know if you can see that or not, but I really like the shape of this bottle and the label.
Much
Mhm.
much peatier on the nose.
This one's much peatier, and I want to just bring.
And it's
I
darker.
want to actually
It is.
discuss a little bit of the distillery itself, which will give you a little more in depth of what they're doing there. Now, Hakushu was actually founded in 1973, up in the Southern Alps of Japan. They were actually the largest whiskey producer in 1990 by producing 7.9 million gallons per year just to appease the market. Now, they have actually tailored it back to about a third of that, but if you ever take a look at the footprint of the Hakushu distillery, you'll hardly see a thing there. They are up in
It's in the woods, isn't it?
yeah, it is just buried in the woods. They have allowed all the trees to go around, not just their distillery, but their rick houses. They have let vines grow over everything. So and they do that to actually retain some of the heat, help the aging process. And most of their rick houses are halfway buried in the ground, even though they may be 10 to 15 barrels high. 5 to 6 of those are below ground, technically, but it's all one story.
So how does that affect their quality? So if they have, I'm assuming they have more than one product, right?
Oh, yeah.
So if you're below ground, obviously the temperature is going to be much
Mhm.
lower. So how do they get the consistency or the
Temperature
movement?
the temperature can be lower, but with it being, it's open to the environment as well. So it'd be like standing in a basement without a floor overhead and then another floor above you. It's open. It's like almost a dunnage.
Don't they? I mean, I assume it's the same as we would see at Buffalo Trace, where they pick all of the pappies out of, was it row 9 or floor 9 or something like that.
Basically, they're all
right in the
considered
middle.
same row, and it's like
Yeah.
only a couple of degree temperature difference between the
Right.
top and the bottom within that same area, as it has constant airflow throughout all of them. It's not. It's half of it's underground, but it's all.
So as opposed to
One
like a
open area.
Kentucky bourbon distillery where you have, the top floor may be 120 degrees in the middle of
Correct.
summer and the bottom floor may be 95.
Yes, it is all one level, even though it may be 10 or 15 high for the ricks. It's all open space. There's no actual floor separating in between them.
All right, Chuck, have you tasted this one?
I have. A little sharper to me. I don't have Justin's palate. I certainly noted more peat on the nose. I find it to be pretty palatable, frankly.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm not real big on peat, but this bourbon, this whiskey, we are a bourbon podcast, but this whiskey here, in my opinion, is far superior to the one we had.
I like it much better than the first one.
Can you
It
base
almost
any green
doesn't-
notes off of this, though?
It almost doesn't taste like whiskey to me.
Oh, really?
I know that sounds strange and weird, It might have been that bologna sandwich I had for lunch today, but it almost tastes like something other than whiskey.
Well, once again, they're going for a different palate. It's not like the whiskey you're used to, which is, like I said before, a roaring river of flavors and profiles trying to compete for each other, trying to get to the forefront. This is calm. It's subtle but deep.
I like flavor. It. Let me be clear. I would keep this on my shelf if I could find it, and if it wasn't too crazy expensive. I assume that both of those are not possible. I like it a lot. It's just different.
I've seen a bottle of that at your store.
Yeah, it's about 100, I think,
give or take.
Yeah.
So the Scotch literally use peat. They dig. They mine peat from the ground.
Correct.
Is there peat found in Japan?
There are some peat bogs in Japan. It is not as prevalent. They prefer the flavor profile of Canadian and Scotch peats.
Okay. And is that a filtration process
for peat?
Yeah.
No, what they do is they'll dry that peat. They'll basically cut it into these 3-foot bricks, and they'll dry them over the span of months. And they'll actually burn them as they're drying the malt to create that smokiness. And they'll do that at the initial stage of drying. So when the malt is wet, that those phenols that come off of the peat will actually stick to the barley, giving it that smoky flavor while the peat's drying, and it'll stay with the peat, or stay with the peat. Phenols will stay with the barley through the distillation process, and impart them into the alcohol as they are water soluble as well as alcohol soluble, depending on the molecular makeup of what's being brought off.
So it's more akin to what they do down at MB Roland when they dark fire some corn, a portion of their corn.
Correct. That peat originally is thousands of years old, decayed plant material, and each bog will give you a different flavor depending on what was decaying in that area. A lot of these Japanese distilleries, they will actually do full peated runs, cast them, let them age, and then they'll blend them in the back end for the different flavor profiles. Now, unlike bourbon, where we're seeing how should I put that? We're seeing batches or their own mash bills come off and recipes, and they're putting out like one at a time. The highest one I think I can recall is like Heaven Hill, where they're getting 10 to 15 maybe different styles coming out of there, but they're also changing mash bills, recipes, aging times, where it's located in the rick house,
different yeasts.
Basically, Japan can do that just from the stills, and let's just go this way. For single malts from Japan, most distilleries will have 2 to 4, either peated and unpeated or lightly and medium peat added in there, so they can have upwards of 4 different styles of whiskey even before they get to the aging process. But then you put into their, say they use the same yeast strains coming in, but then they'll put it on their column stills, or their pot stills. That's another thing I wanted to talk about. Like I said, the Hakushu Distillery currently has 8 pairs of different style stills that they can choose from, and they can go into a worm coil afterwards or a shell and tube system. Even before getting to the cask, they can have upwards of 32 different styles of whiskey just coming out as new make before even getting into a cask, which can bring it up to over 150 different styles of whiskey.
Wow.
Just aging in that rick house. And you don't know, they know where everything is.
Sure. So let me ask you this. And one question that we get asked quite a bit is, hey, I want to start experimenting with bourbon, or my son likes bourbon and I don't know what to get. So what, and I think each of us have different answers, but my standard answers are for Four Roses small batch, because everybody has one of those, and Bourbon Rabbi, and maybe something like a Green River, or and if they want to try rye, I would definitely go to Peerless. So what are the places to start if somebody wanted to start drinking some Japanese whiskeys, which labels are you going to say, well, why don't you try these?
First, I'd say go to a local bar. Because you don't even, what I could recommend to somebody, even after talking to them, may not be part of their palate. Everybody's palate's different. And like I said, most of these imports are not cheap. It's not like going to get a MB Roland that or a Casey Jones
Sure.
that are nice and close that are run between $20 to $60. Most of these bottles run close to $100, and that's something that a lot of people nowadays just don't want to take the risk on, and I would encourage them not to. But my main go-tos, if you can find it, are once again the Hakushu, which is it's a more green, or I'd actually recommend the Yamazaki, which we'll try next.
Okay.
Let's do it. So right now we're about to sample.
This is Yamazaki single malt Japanese whiskey, 12-year, also an 86 proof.
This is the most floral that I've nosed yet.
Mm-hmm.
What are you thinking,
Way
Brian?
Now, when you take a sample of this, I want you to just notice where it sits on your palate.
I get chocolate.
Mm-hmm. Much richer notes.
Dark chocolate.
I say charcoal. This reminds me of cranking up the big green egg and throwing some lamb on there like I did.
Okay.
There is peat in this one.
Man, it's subtle.
Yeah, it's very subtle, but it's there.
This one tastes a lot hotter to me than 86 proof. There's a lot of heat on the forefront whenever I taste it.
I get it more towards the back, but there is a little bit more burn on this one, which is fine. Once again, it's a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
But they are not, once again, they might not be using new charred oak. They're using second or third fill barrels, or even uncharred barrels to help age this. And sometimes they won't even let it sit in a whiskey barrel for its entirety of the aging process of 12 years. They may dump it and put it into something different. So say if it sat in a sherry barrel for 6-7 years, after they've sampled it, say, oh, it's got enough fruit notes. They will dump it and put it into a second or third fill barrel, or even an uncharred oak barrel to continue aging, which will allow the oxidation process to continue on over the years, but it won't impart any more barrel character into the whiskey. So you're more tasting the true grain flavors coming out even after 12 years.
So their process is more labor intensive because they're constantly, they could be potentially dumping barrels and refilling them with.
Correct.
Be an interesting economic investigation to see if using used barrels but having more labor involved in the process is cheaper, or is it more expensive to make this? I'm not sure.
So is woodiness even part of the conversation with Japanese whiskey?
Oh yes, some Japanese whiskeys can get a heavy wood flavor, but those are in certain distilleries. The modern Japanese whiskey that's coming out, or the more common one, is calmer and light with less wood flavor, as the Japanese palate is typically not attuned to heavy oak flavor like the U.S. palate is, even over in Scotland with some of their older ones.
So do they not use first-time oak barrels?
They can. They can.
They
typically don't, or they will use it on a barrel and throw it into the blend. They want heavy oak notes on that one, and then they'll blend it out for everything else. It's like really concentrated for that one barrel, but when they vat it with hundreds of other barrels, it gets to the right level, which is kind of neat.
The Yamazaki's my favorite.
That's exactly what I was about to say.
So far.
And this is a sipper. I'm not going to put any water or maybe some ice. I'm not sure, but it's pretty good as it is.
It's pretty good and neat.
Yeah.
Do you carry this one, Brian?
This one's harder to get.
Of course it is. The one I like is harder to get.
Typically, when we get it, it's on the shelf and out pretty quick.
You have any idea how expensive it is?
150-ish.
Depending on where you can get it, obviously taxes and everything else. Like mine, I think it runs close to 180.
Okay,
which isn't terrible. If you can get it for 150 at your place,
well, if you're buying in Indiana, it's probably cheaper than what I get for. So.
But I get a lot of green melon on this one, and it's fantastic. And you get a lot more tropical fruit notes as you let it open up.
Okay.
but it's absolutely sweet and fruity for me in my palate.
Do you have any idea what Scots think of Japanese whiskey?
Yes, that's the
Yes.
answer.
A lot of them think it's a good imitation, but it's not the real thing.
Okay.
Kind of like what people in Kentucky think of people in Texas trying to do bourbon.
Exactly. I mean, everybody has their own pride. That being said, a true whiskey aficionado will enjoy it. And that's one thing that you need to do is enjoy it for what it is. Appreciate the whiskey from where it's coming from and how they've developed over time. Because that everybody says, oh, what's the best way to drink whiskey? See, people keep saying, oh, drink it neat, throw it on the rocks, put it in the freezer and let it chill for 24 hours.
With your friends is the correct
Yeah,
answer.
with your friends and whatever you like, do that.
Exactly. Drink it how you. That's how you should drink whiskey. But to appreciate whiskey, you got to go back to what was the distiller, what was the blender trying to go for. And the best way for that one is to drink it neat, and to see if they, or if you, to listen to like say the Nose in Scotland. I keep forgetting his name. I think it's Peterson, to how he teaches you how to nose his Dalmore.
Mhm.
Go and actually do some research on how like Japanese will drink their whiskey in a Mitsuwari or in a highball. Maybe that's the best way for you to appreciate what the distiller was trying to go for. So it actually lean you into the direction on how it's meant to be enjoyed.
I think that's really good advice for folks that are interested in that. I think there's also a population that just drink what you want to drink.
Oh yeah.
If you want a sour mash and Coke, like when I was a lot younger, go for it. If you're of legal age,
If you're wanting to drink a Macallan 18 or 25, 50-50 with an orange Fanta, you be my guest. I'm not saying I might have a little heart attack in the car, but I
there you
will
go.
not stop you.
I've read that the Beatles like Scotch and Coke.
They do.
So this next, I guess the last bottle kind of has me scared. The label's turned away, but it reminds me both in color and the shape of the bottle of my grandfather's original Listerine, which is scary stuff.
I will say this will be the most subtle of the expressions. So I actually got this off a recommend after hunting for a bottle of whiskey for my wife. And it's been so for 2 years I've been trying to get her to appreciate whiskey. And during that time frame, she has a absolutely beautiful nose. She can pick out some of the best notes on the nose that you could think of. She can smell the cherry on there. She could think, oh, hey, that smells a little bit of licorice. But when she goes to taste it, every single time she tells me the exact same thing. Yep. Tastes like a moldy old boot. She could not stand the palate of a good whiskey. And that was I tried bourbon. I tried Scotch. I tried Irish. I even tried Canadian. Nothing. Had her try some of these single malts. And she did not like the peat. She did not like the age. For some reason or another, everything was a moldy old boot. But then I found this after visiting a ramen shop in Evansville. They said to try this. They just got it in. It's a pure malt called Shibui. Now, pure malt, once again, malted barley. But they also make a single grain of Shibui, which is actually made out of rice whiskey, but they don't tell you that. Once again, nice subtle notes to it.
So this is Shibui, not to be confused with the Rolling Stones' Shadoobie from the Some Girls album.
So what Shibui has actually come into they're a sourced whiskey company that sources from a few other distilleries in Japan. They've gotten some bad rep for initially doing for their single grain whiskey being rice which throws a lot of whiskey drinkers off because they're thinking once again barley, rye, corn, wheat. But the rice just adds it. It's not a hard like, hey, you're not allowed to use that. It's more of a, nobody else is using it, and it's kind of like you're using this other grain. It's like using sorghum to, even though it's technically in the grain family or a grain relative, it's not what tradition has brought out.
So I get somewhere between cinnamon toast and maple syrup on the nose.
Mm-hmm.
I get musty old boot. No, I'm just kidding.
This one does have part of the malt aged in Mitsunara cask, so you're also getting some of those Mitsunara oak flavors coming through. Can be a little incense. Sandalwood is another high note of that, but
so I'm going to say interesting. I don't know if I would buy that. I'm glad. Thank you very much for allowing us to taste it. I don't know.
Yep.
Very, very unique.
Yeah, my wife likes this.
Chuck, you drinking this again?
Shadoobie. Some of these Japanese whiskeys are bringing out my palate a little bit more, almost like a Luden's cherry lozenge for just a second.
The cherry or the lemon?
I don't think I've ever had the lemon. I had a terrible cough when I was young, so I had a lot of Luden's cherry cough drops, often as a preventative. They are so sugary.
Another thing that you get from Japanese whiskeys are stone fruit flavors as well as citrus flavors coming in. And it's not like a heavy orange flavor that you can get from a rye or a bourbon that's been aged just right. These are more like lemons or a key lime coming in, just brighter notes. And you can get that from actually the Mitsunara. The oak actually has it actually brings out the acidity of a bourbon over time. It just has a higher pH level, which is kind of weird, but I mean, it leads to a brighter flavor profile in the end, which can pair well with single malts or lighter whiskeys.
I tell you, I have kind of a fireworks show going on in my mouth, and I mean that in the very best sense of the term. There's a lot of there's just a lot of exploding flavors going on the finish with this. It's
far different than any bourbon or whiskey I've ever tasted.
No question about it.
Now, one way I'd like you to start nosing this, and this is one it becomes almost to an extreme, is hold your gland at a 45-degree angle, and I want you to nose the top, and then nose the bottom of the glass. So when you do this, put your nose right at the top, breathe in through the mouth and lightly through the nose. You'll get a certain flavor profile coming off of that. And then go all the way to the bottom to where your nose is just hitting the Glencairn and bring it in.
You're not wrong at all.
Usually the lighter profile esters and aldehydes and phenols will come up
to the top
and evaporate up higher with the alcohol, and all the fattier notes, all the richer
getting the oils and all that
exactly,
at the bottom.
The oils, the aromatic compounds that are really heavier will just actually flow off and down out of that glass. But you can get almost the rich caramel. I get a rich caramel down here, and up here I'm getting floral notes, almost like a marigold.
So this could be a little off topic. Just popped in my head actually. So bourbon in Kentucky is a huge economic impact, with bourbon tourism and so forth. Is that the same in Japan? I mean, is there just distilleries inviting guests to come out and see their process?
Not necessarily. I mean, I hate to say it, but unlike the bourbon boom we've had over the last better part of a decade, where companies are investing millions upon millions of dollars into tourism, they're not doing as much to Japanese whiskey.
Well, very interesting. So at one point, one of us said, we really should do a show about the Japanese market and the influence it's had on the U.S. bourbon market. And Brian says, "Hey, I got this guy. We got to get him." And yeah, you were right, man. Justin, thank you so much. What a great well of knowledge you are, and thank you for bringing all of these. We really appreciate it. Enjoyed doing this tasting very much. This can't be your last visit with us. We're going to have to bring you back and drink some more whiskey. So I've got one last question for you. You're at home. You've got a couple of bottles
Just a couple
of whiskey around your house.
Hopefully, my wife doesn't find them all.
Yeah, exactly. So how often are you reaching for a Japanese whiskey?
Personally, once a month.
Okay.
Of course, with what I want to taste, I mean, the majority of the time I'm reaching for a bourbon or a Scotch.
Yeah.
I go for Irish as well. Japanese is always there. It's right next to everything else, but it depends on whether I'm in a peated mood, unpeated mood. I drink for what I feel I need to calm.
Yeah, sure.
Japanese is almost, I'd say after a long day, I'm making a Mitsuwari, or if I just mow the lawn, I'm making a Mitsuwari. It cools you down. It refreshes you. But afterwards, I'll drink that Yamazaki and just enjoy it right by the camp, right by a fire.
Fantastic. If you want to hear more from Justin, be sure to check out our friends over at the Broken Cork Podcast. You can find that on Facebook. You can find it, I think, just about anywhere where you can find podcasts. Is that true?
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you very much, my friend, for being here. And thank you for listening. We have enjoyed this. This is something different for us.
For real.
And I thought it was fantastic. You guys have anything else you want to bring to the table?
It's complicated. They could not have been more different. Yes, the peat is definitely there, but these are very distinct products.
Yeah.
It ain't slapping your face like Lefroy does.
Yeah.
He is not the enemy of every whiskey
Yeah,
drinker.
I would say definitely, like Justin said, go to your local bar that has a good whiskey selection and try these different whiskeys. They may not be for you, or they may be. Just try them. And
I'm hoping my liquor store has a tasting sometime soon of all the products that they sell, and
Japanese,
and maybe I'll just show up
Justin might be the
and
one
try
doing
them
it.
out.
Brian, if you need it, I got you, man.
All right.
All right.
Anytime.
Sounds great.
Well, thank you, folks, and please, if you do drink responsibly.
Cheers.